גילה אמאטי היא תלמידת דוקטורט באוניברסיטת אוקספורד במחלקה תיאולוגיה ולימודי דת. עבודת הדוקטורט שלו עוסקת בפילוסופיה, החיים של הרב קוק, עיון בכתביו דרך הגותו של הפילוסוף הצרפתי אנרי ברגסון. מאמריך של גילה בתחום זה פורסמו ועתידים להתפרסם בכתב העת Religions and Harvard Theological Review.
שלום, אז אני אדבר באנגלית, אפשר אחר כך שאלות בעברית. אז אני אתחיל. I'm happy to be here today to present this paper. In my study, I want to contribute to the ongoing discourse on Rabbi Cook's theory of knowledge by examining it through the lens of the French life philosopher Henri Bergson. Through this analysis, I want to show that Rabbi Cook's epistemology can be better understood by considering it in light of Bergson's Leibniz philosophical perspective. In his writings, Rabbi Cook explores different levels of perceptions and uses multiple terms that appear to overlap and even contradict each other. I am to demonstrate in this presentation that it is possible and enlightening to understand and interpret this terminology in Rabbi Cook through the lens of Bergson's philosophy of intuition. This analysis also shows that, contrary to what has been suggested in previous research, Rabbi Cook shouldn't be associated with the context of postmodernism or pragmatism. Rather, his epistemological theory should be understood in the context of Bergson's philosophy of life and interpreted in that light. Previous research has focused on understanding the different levels of perception in Rabbi Cook. In his book Between Rationalism and Mysticism, Binyamin Shalom attempts to interpret and clarify what Rabbi Cook defines as the different degrees of perception. Shalom rightly notices that Rabbi Cook explicitly identifies 8 different levels of perceptions. These are senses of the flesh, imagination, intelligence, divine inspiration, prophecy, the unclear looking glass, the clear looking glass, the heavenly brightness of Adam, the first man, and the light after the perfection. Shalom then focuses on the lowest levels of perception. According to him, I quote, "In 3 places, with slight variations, Rabbi Cook distinguishes among these spiritual levels, which he calls cognitive stages." End of quote. These cognitive stages, as stated by Rabbi Cook himself, are the body, imagination, feeling, intellect, and supreme attentiveness. Today, like Shalom, we will primarily focus on imagination, feeling, and intellect. Shalom points out that while in some passages feeling and imagination are considered by Rabbi Cook as lower degrees of perception than the intellect, in other passages Rabbi Cook considers imagination as a higher degree of perception than the intellect. To explain this apparent contradiction, Shalom argues that for each level of perception exists, according to Rav Cook, a higher and a lower side. Consequently, the lower side of the intellect is posited at a lesser level of perception than the higher side of feelings and imagination, and vice versa. However, it remains unclear from Shalom's distinction what is the actual meaning of the higher or lower sides of intellect and imagination or feeling, and what differentiates between the two, besides there being higher or lower forms. Moreover, this interpretation does not tell us enough about the content of imagination and intellect. What does Rabbi Cook mean by imagination? What are higher and lower imagination, feeling, and intellect? What makes an imagination higher or lower? Are higher and lower imaginations qualitatively different from each other in Rabbi Cook's view? To answer these questions, I suggest reading Rabbi Cook's works through the perspective of Bergson's Leibniz philosophy. I propose that when Rabbi Cook discusses what Shalom identifies as the lower aspects of imagination and emotion, he is alluding to Bergson's concept of instinct, which is considered a lower form of perception compared to the intellect. On the other hand, I claim that Rabbi Cook identifies the higher side of imagination, which is a higher degree of perception than the intellect, with Bergson's intuition. This intuition is not yet complete and reaches its highest level when it arrives at what Rabbi Cook defines, I quote, "the supreme attentiveness which comes from the sparking of exalted divine inspiration, or the appearance of the holy beyond the intellect." Bergson draws a distinction between intelligence and instinct in his theory of evolution. According to him, these two tendencies developed out of the l'âme vitale, the original principle, in its process of adaptation to matter, and therefore share the same origin. Bergson attributes instinct to the animal world, while he argues that mankind is endowed with intelligence. This distinction does not imply that there is not intelligence in animals and not instinct in human beings, but only underlines that each species holds in different proportions each one of these tendencies. Bergson defines instinct as a kind of impulsiveness and immediacy. Its knowledge of objects is natural and direct, but it is limited to a specific content and can be applied only to a finite number of organic objects and specific situations. Instinct sees its goals spontaneously, without the intervention of consciousness. It knows how to exploit the organic instruments of the body and is molded on the very form of life. On the other hand, from the point of view of intelligence, the world is discontinuous and disconnected from the very form of life. Intelligence tends to divide, define, and spatialize things in the world to make sense of them. It develops generalizations and laws, language, and concepts that confine the eternal flowing of life into static forms that will later help human beings act upon reality and ensure their survival. Its work is far from being a disinterested one and brings the individual to a practical and pragmatic but wrongful and superficial understanding of the universe that does not consider its being enduring. Therefore, while instinct is directly connected to the elan vital itself but lacks any ability to go beyond its existing and known functions, intellect is incredibly innovative but is characterized by a natural inability to comprehend life. By intuition, Bergson means a certain refined form of instinct, and he defines it as, I quote, the instinct that has become disinterested, self-conscious, capable of reflecting upon its object and of enlarging it indefinitely. End of quote. Bergson describes intuition as a very rare and immediate form of knowledge, which allows individuals to grasp life beyond the relative structures of intelligence and to attain an absolute perception of the real duration of existence. It is also defined by Bergson as a sympathy, as it is the ability to grasp objects in their immediate, real, unique, and ineffable essence, outside any form of spatialization and analysis. Through intuition, we understand that the schemas of intellect are unable to perceive the living and creative aspects of life. Intuition is not, therefore, mere psychological introspection, but the instrument that allows us to grasp the unitary and simple essence that lies at the root of all things. It is a knowledge that has an essentially simple nature, not an analytical one. Taking into account Bergson's distinction, it's now time to revisit Rabbi Kook's understanding of the different levels of perception. As I mentioned earlier, I suggest that when Rabbi Kook refers to imagination and feeling as a higher or lower forms of perception relative to the intellect, he is sometimes alluding to instinct and other times to intuition. When imagination and feeling are viewed as instinct, Rabbi Kook regards the intellect as higher on the scale of types of understanding. However, when imagination and feeling are seen as intuition, that is, as a refined instinct through the intellect is considered a lower type of understanding. Feeling and imagination in their higher form are refined through the intellect and are thus higher than it. They can comprehend the aspects of reality that are beyond the spatial, scientific, and intellectual understanding and can reconnect us to the divine essence of existence. In the following passage, Rabbi Kook described imagination as a dangerous, instinctual, and almost physical force that, being very powerful, needs to be mitigated to prevent human beings from being overwhelmed by it. Rabbi Kook writes, I quote, "Caution and refining needs the imagination. The individual needs to protect himself greatly from its mist, the cures of its way of life, its complication and twists." Yet, in the continuation of this same passage, Rabbi Kook states that if this imagination is refined and mitigated by the intellect, it reestablishes contact with the flow of life and becomes elevated to something positive, which Bergson calls intuition. Rabbi Kook writes, I quote, "And the imagination and Holy Spirit, in a vision of inner purity, it will go and refine, go and adapt, until the viewing of the mirror will increase and be strengthened, until all his pulses become clear, until all his movements and visions, his history and effects on his own life are established and connect with the scientific basis, with real life, with the great paintings. And from the upper river, light will be washed over the imagination, and it will go and improve, go and enrich itself, go and refine itself on, and the rivers of Eden will be washed, and the dew of life will be discovered in it, and the sources of pleasure from its midst will spring out." In another passage, he describes again the two kinds of imagination, higher and lower. one clothed and refined by intelligence, which is parallel to Bergson's intuition, and another that is without the influence of intelligence, and is parallel to sin and animal instincts. I quote, "Imagination clothes itself in a special form when the intelligence acts upon it. This form is holy, gladdening the world and cleansing man from all his impurity. And whenever this form is obscured and imagination is conceived by its own law, without the influence of intelligence, then it becomes the most sure source of all misfortune, and all sin or suffering in both private and public life. When imagination is at the level of intuition, it helps us attain and perceive the divine light of God. I quote Rav Kook, "Imagination is the shadow of the intellect, and at times above intellect, not by its own virtue, but because it is like a substance illuminated by divine light. There are thus two unique attributes in imagination whose law varies. On the one hand, the shadow of intellect it contains, and on the other, its ability to receive illumination. The imagination in its highest refinement is higher than the intellect. The same as intuition in Bergson is higher than intellect and can attain a perception of reality and the world that is much deeper. While the imagination makes us closer to the spiritual aspects of the world and the true essence of existence, it distances us from the practical world and from pragmatic goals for which, as we have seen in Bergson, the intellect is responsible." Rabbi Kook adds that imagination helps us grasp the deep essence of existence, something that, like in Bergson, cannot be attained by the narrow intellect. I quote, "Our rational mind is but a humble pupil who explains but a glimmer of all the living light in the treasure house of our imagination, which is rich and holy, which lives a life of supreme reality, subduing real existence with the force of its own independent thing." End of quote. Imagination as intuition is for Rabbi Kook the way through which we attain knowledge of the content of the deepest aspects of our soul. The knowledge attained by this intuition is valuable, even if and just because it contradicts the schematic and spatial understanding of the intellect. And I quote, even when the intellect does not agree with the ideas of imagination, they retain their independent value, for imagination is a whole world in and of itself. Only its additional blessing allows it to become one with the intellect, and the two are joined together in their highest source, supreme beyond intellect and imagination alike. Not only imagination, but also feeling is described by Rabbi Kook in many passages in a way that is similar to Bergson's intuition, and it is contrasted to the intellect. Feeling, unlike imagination, is almost always described positively, and it is therefore a step closer to intuition. Rabbi Kook, in fact, describes feelings as immediate and unmediated, and as able to grasp the wholeness of reality, even if in a raw manner, and contraposes it to the intellect, which results from a long process of learning. He writes, I quote, "Feeling is quicker than the intellect. In feeling, the term God is fertile and abounding with being even before a single one of the vast store of secret concealed in it has been solved. This is not for intellect. The mind needs to process. Nothing comes without study and pursuit." Therefore, if imagination and feeling are considered as instinct, intellect becomes the highest form of understanding. However, if imagination and feeling are seen as intuition, they become higher than the intellect itself and can reconnect to the divine essence of existence. Rabbi Kook, like Bergson, deals explicitly with the difference between instinct, intuition, and intelligence. For him, the intellect and instinct focus on the particular, while intuition, the istaklut ruchanit, is able to grasp the big picture and to look at things in their deep unity, beyond their apparent contradiction. Furthermore, intellectual knowledge weakens man's life force and instinctual connection to natural life. Rabbi Kook writes, I quote, as the inferential intellect develops, it values existence not by natural decision, but in intellectual judgment, and the control of the natural tendency is immediately weakened. On the other hand, everyone with a strong instinct is weak in those matters that require reasoning and deliberation. A sort of mature link with nature can only be revealed through intuition, not because of a blind urge, but from a clear internal understanding. Intuition is the highest form of knowledge, and the truth which it attains is simple, since the loftier the truth, the simpler it is. End of quote. Bergson as well relates to the simplicity of the ideas we attain through intuition and the difficulty in expressing it through our intellectual instruments. I quote, "All the complexity of his doctrine, which would go on ad infinitum, is therefore only the incommensurability between his simple intuition and the means at his disposal for expressing it. Moreover, Rabbi Kook writes explicitly about the limits of intelligence in a way that is very much reminiscent of Bergson. He writes that while the intellectuals think they are above the simple people, they are mistaken. This is because the simple people are specifically the closest to nature. Their natural feelings and the senses were not ruined by the influence of culture, and their knowledge is less filtered by intellectual categories. Precisely the simple people, therefore, are able to make more precise moral choices out of natural sentiment and attain genuine faith, and therefore have a grasp of the true essence of existence. Bergson is contradictory in his views on the relationship between intuition and intellect. In Time and Free Will, he seems to consider intellect and intuition as complementary functions. According to him, according to his interpretation, the intellect provides knowledge about external matter, while intuition reveals the true essence and movement of existence, real duration. In his work, Introduction to Metaphysics, intellect and intuition are highly interconnected, and intuition is identified as intellectual sympathy. However, in his later work, Creative Evolution, Bergson seems to argue that intuition is superior to the intellect. This is because intuition alone can immediately perceive and penetrate reality. On the other hand, the intellect performs a purely practical and pragmatic function, helping us survive, but it cannot provide us with any true insights about the essence of life. Regarding the relationship between intuition and intellect, Rabbi Kook seems to adopt the complementary approach, arguing that each of the two levels of perception has its own role, and they should coexist harmoniously. He writes that even the development of science itself is based on the interplay of imagination, that is, intuition, and intellect. Science is built on two bases, the imaginary and the intellectual. These are the two elements of composing the science, and their balanced combination they stand in a state of effervescence, combating each other, and in their effervescence all the branches of the human spirit are renewed. The higher disposition of the intellect weakens the imagination, ruining the balance of science. The disposition of imagination, meanwhile, blurs the intellect, and particular deficiencies become apparent in the system of scientific knowledge. A sound science is produced from the balanced combination of imagination and intellect. In a different passage, Rabbi Kook talks about the complementarity of the two levels of perception and the need for both of them to attain the divine. I quote, "Great enlightened men must draw their holy light from the heights of the intellect and not from the soul's excitement or an inflated imagination, and from simple faith alone, but rather from the illumination of all of this." Finally, Rabbi Kook agrees with Bergson that human beings underestimate the role of intuition and tend to believe that the intellect is enough to attain a complete understanding of existence. Yet, it is not possible to really connect the original essence of the world without intuition. In Rabbi Kook's own words, imagination has qualities that intellect lacks. Imagination animates in us the world in spiritual form, making our spiritual essence more complete. But as it prevails, it obscures the outline of the real world. The endeavors of culture have greatly enriched practical science, as well as the spiritual founded upon it, but the world of imagination and all of its vitality has been greatly diminished. Thus, the present personality is much inferior to the former one, especially that of great individuals whose imagination prevailed, gain its rightful share from the practical intellect. Thus, to Rabbi Kook, while engrossed in our imagination, we tend to neglect the pragmatic dimensions of our being. However, the scientific discipline's functional, systematic, and specialized approach has weakened intuition and imagination and has distanced us from the divine and spiritual aspects of reality. Consequently, it emerges that the intellect and the intuitive imagination exhibit a complementary interdependence, necessitating their coexistence in our life. So I hope to have shown how adopting a Bergsonian approach has aided in interpreting the seemingly inconsistent and unclear language utilized by Rabbi Kook in his differentiation of various levels of perception. By utilizing this lens, the study has expanded upon Shalom's previous interpretation, enabling a systematic analysis of Rabbi Kook's writings on the subject matter through a three-part model of instinct, intellect, and intuition. This has allowed for a clarification of the relationship between these distinct modes of perception and a more comprehensive understanding of Rabbi Kook's theoretical framework.
שאלות. שאלות. אחד, כן, עוד אחד. שתיים. אוקיי, בבקשה.
I'm quite convinced by what you are showing us. I have very small two questions, like of clarification. So, what would be the Hebrew equivalence of imagination and intuition in Rabbi Cook? So, I think it's for us important to
כן, כן.
and that's one. And two is, I think, if I'm not wrong, that you didn't elaborate on how would duration, in fact, operate within Cook's understanding of intuition. So if in person it's very essential, so what happens in Thank you.
אוקיי.
יש הערה בהקדמה לאורות הקודש, שרב הנזיר אומר שהוא קיבל דעה ששיטת הרב קוק דומה לשיטת ברקסון, והוא מעיר על זה, יש הבדל כהבדל בין קודש לחול. רציתי לשאול אם יש לך איזה רעיון למה הוא התכוון.
אפשר לנו? כן. אז לגבי, אני אענה בעברית, לגבי המילים זה דמיון, imagination אני מתכוונת לדמיון, ו-feeling זה רגש.
ואינטואיציה?
זה מה שאני טוענת שצריך לפרש כאינטואיציה. זה המילים שהרב קוק משתמש בהם, וההצעה שלי זה להבין אותם עם המושג של אינטואיציה של ברקסון. הוא לא משתמש במילה אינטואיציה. אז ולגבי duration, אז אין מילה מפורשת, הוא לא משתמש במילה הזאת באופן מפורש, ואצלו זה מושג הרבה יותר כללי, אבסטרקט, כלומר אני חושבת שהתפיסת המציאות שלו ודרך הכתיבה שלו והגישה שלו למציאות היא גישה כזאת שמכירה בהתפתחות המתמדת של הדברים, בזרימה של הדברים, וזה כאילו בעצם המהות של המציאות, אבל הוא בטח לא מפתח איזה תורה מדויקת כמו התורה של ברקסון, אז זה שם, אבל לא באופן מפורש. כן, ולגבי הרב הנזיר, בעצם מה הקשר בין ברקסון ורב קוק מלכתחילה? אז הרב הנזיר מתכוון לאמירה של קמינקה, שהוא היה הוגה באותה תקופה, שכתב לרב קוק שהוא וברקסון והכתיבה שלהם מאוד מאוד דומה. הוא כותב מאוד מאוד דומה לפילוסוף שנמצא עכשיו בצרפת. והרב קוק גם מגיב לאותו קמינקה ואומר לו שלא יכול להיות שהוא דומה לפילוסוף צרפתי, שהדברים שהוא כותב הם באים רק מעולה של תורה ולא מהשפעה של פילוסופים מערביים. וגם יש פסקה אחת באורות הקודש ובקבצים שבה הרב קוק מתייחס לברקסון באופן מפורש ממש, ולפסקה הזאת הרב נזיר גם מתכוון, ושם הוא כותב שהתורה של ברקסון היא תורה של התפתחות מתמדת, אבל אין בסוף איזושהי מטרה מוחלטת שאליה אנחנו שואפים, ולכן זה החטא הנורא של העמדה הזאת. אז אני חושבת שלזה הרב נזיר מתכוון, לתפיסה הזאת של הרב קוק ולהבנה הזאת של הרב קוק של ברקסון. אני חושבת בעיקר בכתבים המאוחרים של ברקסון שהרב קוק לא יכל להכיר, כי הוא כתב אותם מעט לפני שהרב קוק נפטר, זה לא בדיוק ככה, וגם לברקסון נראה שיש איזו מטרה סופית, אבל זה כבר לא כל כך קשור ליחס של הרב קוק לברקסון עצמו. אבל כן, זה המקום היחיד גם שהרב קוק מתייחס לברקסון באופן מפורש בפסקה הזאת, והרב הנזיר מתייחס לאותה פסקה בהקדמה של אורות הקודש. כן.
תודה רבה. אוקיי.